Okay, I'm going to talk to you about where education and regulation meet, and unfortunately that tends to be the field of European regulation or European law. If I were to ask everyone in this room why we regulate architecture, I'm sure I would hear things like consumer protection, quality in the built environment, public safety, public well-being. I might even hear beauty, but that's not why Europe is regulating architects. So what I want to do today is talk to you about how European regulation works, how it impacts education and architects, and possibly the ways that we can work with that to improve things. So I'm going to just start very briefly with the context, move on to how European law has developed in this area. And I'm not a lawyer, so it won't be very technical. How the systems of recognition work, how the modernisation of law has changed, the opportunities that we can see, perhaps areas where the profession and the educators can work together to make things better, the area of international recognition, the role played by the ACE, and then some little warning areas that we're worried about at the moment. Which way do I point this? Oh, keep it here. Okay, thanks, Lucia. Okay, no, I've lost one. Sorry. So, context. The two main European legal instruments for regulating architects are the Professional Qualifications Directive, which is the main one, and then on a secondary level, there's the Services Directive, which I'm not going to talk about. And this is where the key point comes. These directives do not come from anything to do with construction or health and safety or public well-being. They are developed and they are implemented by DG GROW, Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. All of the drivers behind the development of this legislation come from the expansion of the single market. Everything that is done in terms of professional regulation for architecture and all the other professions in Europe is driven by the single market unit. It is not driven by any other purposes. So we are constantly fighting the battle of explaining why we regulate, because their objective, with the best will in the world, it's where they're coming from, it's their job, is to expand the single market. And they think that by changing regulation, particularly for architecture, because construction is so important, they can expand the market. So in any work we do in this area, we must be aware of that driver. So, 1985 saw the introduction of the Architects Directive. It dealt with architects alone. It recognised qualifications in Europe that met an agreed minimum standard, which is now Article 46 of the modern directive. And it allowed a top-up. If there was a big difference between qualifications, or if you had a professional practice in your own state, you could add a year for people who didn't have it in their home state. In 2005, the Commission brought it all together in the Professional Qualifications Directive, which allegedly covers somewhere between 500 and 800 professions. 7 of those are covered by a specific regime, which I'll talk about in a moment, the automatic regime, and architects are in many ways privileged to be in that regime, but it brings its own problems. Then in 2000 and last year, we had the modernisation of the directive, and that has seen some changes, which does present opportunities that I think we just need to touch on today. And the biggest difference for architecture is that we have gone from a minimum standard of 4 years, and this is absolute minimum, lowest common denominator. It's not the average, it's not the norm, it's the minimum. So we've gone from 4 years to either 4 + 2 or 5 years. So the standard qualification period is 5 years, and there's a 4 + 2 alternative, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So, automatic, as I said, doctors, nurses, midwives, dentists, pharmacists, vets and architects. So we are in a very privileged group in many ways. The way it works is the qualification is recognised in the home state. The home state then notifies it to Europe. Every other state gets to look at it. This only applies for architects. It doesn't apply for doctors or nurses or anyone else. It's just architects. Every member state gets to look at it and decide if it meets the standard. Under the new regulations, it is only then published. The competent authority in the home state says, yes, this person has met all of the requirements, and then the architect has the legal right to establish in other EU member states. In many ways, it's very good. It allows for easy recognition. As Ian said at ACE yesterday, we have 94% positive recognition between member states of architects, which is remarkable. There are other systems, the general system and temporary and occasional, which I won't talk about. I don't think they're particularly relevant today. And back to the purpose. So the directive is about mobility. It doesn't overtly address requirements within states, but through that process I've just described to you, you can see how it will nevertheless impact architectural educational standards in EU member states. So we still have the competence to do things ourselves at national level, but if we want into the automatic regime, we've got to meet the standards that apply there and be ready for that scrutiny. The change that I can see is coming is that in the 1985 directive, it reflected what was happening. From 2005 onwards, it's influencing. It is having a formative and even, I think, normative effect on architectural education, which we must be aware of and resist to some extent to maintain diversity. So to look at the automatic regime for a moment, as I said, we're up from 4 years to 5, or this 4+2 model. In the 4+2 model, which is not the same as what we understand as, say, an RIBA Part 1, 2 and 3 as the sort of the most well-known model. In Ireland, we have a 5-year degree and a professional practice exam. It's not quite the same as that because the 2 years obviously are bringing you up to the 5. They must be supervised. The competent authority must be happy with the supervisor. So it's not quite the same as what people in the room understand as practical professional experience. The impact it may have in the future now is that non-compliant qualifications, so those 5-year qualifications with a year of pure specialisation or 4-year qualifications that don't have the new 2 years, will be removed from the directive and removed from the recognition regime. That process is underway at the moment. And to be clear, just because I know not everybody here is in the regulation field, the member state, your state government and your competent authority will decide which model you're in. The majority of states are in the 5-year qualification model. And just to give you an idea what it used to be like, the blue is the formal qualification period and the red is practical professional experience. This is what things were like before the directive hit. So in ACE, we like to collect data so we know what's happening and so we can track change. So this was a data collection we did before modernisation kicked in. We'll look at it again in a year or so. I suspect we will see some changes. The main message from this is that member states were all above the then minimum of 4 years. Nobody. The lowest there is a 5-year formal qualification or 4 years plus 2 or 3 with practical experience. So nobody was at the minimum level. Everyone was above it. And we hope, obviously, that continues to be the case. So further changes, I'll go through these quickly. You can do your practical professional experience in any EU country. It doesn't matter if your home state is going to examine you at the end. You have a legal right to do the actual experience anywhere. For inclusion in the automatic regime, specialism can only be addressed after the 4+2 or the 5. So if you have a 5-year qualification and you want to have a year of specialisation, you have to go to 6 years from now on. And of I think, major importance possibly to the schools is that Article 46, which is the 11 statements that define the minimum standard in Europe, is now much more open to change than it ever was before. It used to be that it could only be changed by a vote of the European Parliament. Now the Commission can change it under a delegated act, which is reviewed by the Parliament. So there may be more move for change, and as you'll see, I think there are potential opportunities there. Common training frameworks, I won't talk about them now because we'll come back to them. Access to the profession cannot be restricted on the basis of nationality or residence. And there's a greater obligation with CPD, as my ACE colleagues will know. The Commission's use of the terms ensure by encouraging are causing us some difficulties, because I don't know how you ensure anything by encouraging, but the Commission has put a focus on CPD in the Organised directive. So on to the opportunities. I'm more than halfway through now, Pella. So architecture still has to be the principal component, obviously. That text hasn't changed. But Article 46 remains the minimum requirement. And as you'll all be aware, there are 11 broad statements that people understand in a variety of ways. For a qualification to get into the automatic regime, you must meet those 11 statements. But they're broad. There must be room for specialisation. There must be room for the regulators, the professional bodies and the schools to work together to ensure that diversity is maintained and that schools can distinguish themselves. I think engagement between the schools, the professional bodies and the regulators is therefore very important, that the schools can still distinguish themselves, and that the possible evolution of Article 46 reflects necessary change. I suppose this is the area I'm looking forward to. There will be pressure to change Article 46 over time. The Commission likes being busy and doing things. At some point they'll decide it needs a review, and I think it is essential that the profession are feeding in from what's happening on the ground, and the schools are feeding in from your observations with your students and your work, so that any proposals we work together to make sure that they are what will be good for the profession and the built environment and the public. And the common training frameworks may play a factor as well. Under the new directive, they have a system called Common Training Frameworks, whereby if 2/3 of member states agree on something, it can go in almost like an automatic recognition regime. Because architecture is already in the automatic regime, its specialisations can be covered in the Common Training Framework. I have no opinion on whether we should have formal specialisation or not, but that is the legal tool that would be used if there is a desire to pursue it on a major basis. So the last opportunity there, international recognition. The work that's been done in Europe and the ACE, Luciano has been very involved in this, and Ian Pritchard also. The CETA agreement with Canada, the first appendix to it will be a mutual recognition for architects. And it will work on a 12-year basis. So if you have a 7-year formal education, a further 5 of practical experience will get you recognised in Canada. If you have a 5-year qualification, you'll need an extra 7 to get up to the 12. But it is hoped that this will be signed in October and will expand mobility between Canada and Europe, so the move abroad and get better opportunities may open up further in a more consistent way. TTIP is just ... It was moving, it had slowed down. Mr. Trump was elected. Nobody knows what's happening now. I think nothing is happening. So it will remain like that for a while, I think. So just briefly, what does ACE do? The ACE's role here is to bring member organisations from across Europe together so we understand. The schools meet together as well. This is our version to understand what's happening and to influence policy. We maintain strong communication with the Commission. The Secretary-General and the President in particular have developed very, very strong relationships with the Commission, which means that we can get in and talk about possible policy changes early, which is very, very important. We engage actively in all EU consultations, which I think Ian would agree can be very tiring, but sometimes productive. We support member organisations in their own positions. One of the things we do that I'm very attached to is providing an observatory of what's going on, like the research we did before the directive was modernised. When you're talking to the Commission, you need your own data because they don't give you theirs. They just tell you their conclusions. So it is very important that we have our own data and a clear understanding of what's happening. So that's a very important role of the ACE. Obviously, we work with the EAAE and with other bodies, and we work and engage internationally, which is obviously the source of the Canadian agreement. And then this is my final area. There are areas of concern arising now which are probably not of immediate concern to education or the schools, but which may evolve. There's a legislative package, which Luciano referred to earlier, looking at regulation in the professions. There's a great interest in architecture because there's a strong belief that it can be used to drive much higher employment and a much stronger services economy within the EU. And on point C there, the requirement is that regulation must be suitable for securing the attainment of the objective pursued and must not go beyond what is necessary to attain that objective. I'm not aware of any regulatory system in Europe for architects that goes beyond, but the European Commission remains convinced that we overregulate. I mentioned earlier that CPD had been updated or upgraded in its mentions in the directive. This little graph here shows the Commission's own restrictiveness indicator on access to the profession. And having on the one hand 2 years ago said that CPD should be actively encouraged, now it's being included in a restrictiveness indicator. So states that have CPD requirements are seen to be more restrictive. as a regulator, as somebody who works for a professional body and a regulator, I think CPD is a good thing. It contributes to consumer protection. It's like qualifications in education, but it is now being presented as a restrictor. So we need to, this is part of understanding the environment that we are working in. So just finally, this is the legislative package. It is designed to create more mobility in Europe. It is something the ACE is working very closely on, and it is something that we may need to engage the EAAE on in due course, as there is always the potential for it to influence qualification requirements. And that's me. Thank you.